I think the only thing that comes to mind is I think the one thing that we kind of all share with what we talked about is like we made the data, right? It didn't exist. It was something that was kind of a passion of ours in some way or another, and we kind of made it. Like, what considerations, from the outset, and how many kind of steps back did each of you take when it came to kind of handcrafting the data that you worked with on your project? Or are there benefits to working on something that you actually want to work on versus here's a spreadsheet, come up with a report, tell me what's what?
Yeah, I think the data set that the film project was a data set from dust, had not existed before really. Oddly, people have done projects like that before, but they haven't open sourced it. So academia has done plenty of diversity reports, but they don't open source anything. So I think I feel a lot of ownership over it and felt a little bit guarded to open source it. But then I was like, oh, that's lame. But I think that happens when you put a lot of effort into making something new. You're like, oh, it's mine. Why are you reusing all the work that I put into this thing and maybe falsely portraying it somehow?
Yeah, I think there's a feeling of arbitrage or something when you're working on a data set that maybe isn't widely available, or you're taking an angle into it that hasn't been taken before. That can be really exciting and sort of drive you through these long hours and crappy sort of reboots of a broken analysis, something like that.
One of the things that I think is interesting is you guys all worked on projects that took a really long time in journalistic time, and yet in academic time, science takes time, and so we're used to that. And now I'm engaged in this journalist work, which feels really fast-paced to me because I'm turning these things around every week, and that's really hard for me. And I sometimes get overwhelmed in creating. So my data are not yet publicly available, but they will be after the election. And part of that is so that I've spent a lot of money on this data project, and I can publish from it, and then I'll put it out there and let other people kick it around and publish from it too. But I get this sense of sort of overwhelming anxiety that I'm missing big things in the data because I'm going fast. Not that everybody makes mistakes and hopefully we catch them, but that I'm missing opportunities to explore things that would be really interesting and helpful, but I just don't have the time to dig into.
I cannot remember who said this, but it was at a talk a couple months ago in Portland, but they said that data journalism is social science on a deadline, which I feel like that's why it's faster, maybe.
It's a real tension, though, because science takes time. Nobody does science fast. And so there is this tension, and I struggle with it all the time.
Great. Let's take one from the audience now. Who has a question for the panelists? And we're going to limit it to just two panelists. You can direct it towards a panelist, or else they will. Two of them will answer it. Whoever hasn't answered a question yet. You were the first one with your hand up. Just name, organization, and question.
Connor Barclay, Ernst & Young. Question on that note would be, how do you decide how to allocate your time when you are working on tight deadlines? I mean, what's a road worth exploring, and what's a road that isn't?
Joe.
So that's definitely one of the biggest challenges, I would say, about doing data-driven journalism. With this project that I talked about specifically, we spent a couple weeks before we actually settled on the project we were going to do, analyzing all of the data that we had on Kobe Bryant, looking for trends and trying to figure out what made him special. And after all of this analysis, the only thing we could really come up with was that he shot a lot. So we didn't find any trends in where he shot because he shot from everywhere, and we didn't find any types of shots that he took because he just took all the same types of shots as everyone else. So it just so happens that he took a ton of them. So that's kind of what we had to focus on. But at some point during that analysis, when we were digging deeper and deeper, trying to find something to do a project on, at some point we had to call it because his last game was 2 weeks away or whatever. So, so it's definitely a challenge.
And we don't get better answering a question about deadlines than an LA Times reporter. So I'm going to cap it there. And then Lynn, if you want to ask a question, any two panelists can answer. You can direct it if you want.
Well, I was just going to say that one of the things that's interesting about the different projects is that some of them are purely exploratory. You know, where are these shootings happening and why are they? We don't know, and we're going to go find out. But a lot of the other ones have some kind of a hunch, or in my world, we would say a theory about what we expect the behavior to be. And like you guys thought, like there's going to be a place where he's a great shooter, and then you find out, oh, there's not, you know. And you had some hunch about what might be attractive, and so I guess. I am curious as to whether you guys get your motivation from the real world, like what's happening in context, or whether these are longstanding questions that you personally have been interested in, and how you decide which one of those two projects to pursue. If your work gives you the flexibility to do either one, or if you feel pressure to do one or the other.
Chris.
What were the two choices?
Uh,
It's a mix of both, right? So
Both, Chris.
it's getting handed things and say, hey, we need to pursue this, versus me kind of surfacing things. I learned a while ago not to go in with a hunch. I mean, you have a hunch, right? But I think it's a generic hunch anymore, where it's like there's something there. I don't know what it's going to be, and just kind of let things kind of go where they were. There was an early report that came out of a shooting in South LA, Ezell Ford, who was shot 2 days after Michael Brown in Ferguson. And it was kind of the first kind of like entree into this narrative that occurs, you know, during the investigation into a police shooting. And so, you know, we had a hunch that there were going to be a lot of unarmed people and that there were going to be bad shootings. And you know what? I mean, you know, the stat that was cited on air was, you know, 1/4 were of those shot were unarmed. Well, 3/4 were armed. You know, many of them did things preceding being shot that, if I was a police officer, I might fear for my life. And so I think that is one thing that kind of came out of it, right? Is we knew there was something there. We didn't know what the there was, right? I don't know if that answers your question or not. I prefer working on things where I don't know where it's going to go. You know, I kind of like the adventure finding what it's going to be.
Just talking about hunches or theories, I guess. When we were doing our exploratory kind of dig into the data, we sort of started out with kind of basic stuff, and then as we were not finding anything, we kind of started to like unconsciously apply the scientific method, where we'd say, well, maybe he's good at this. And so let's, you know, come up with a way to find out and test that and see if he is. And, you know, of course he is, but not particularly. So, you know, try for something else. But sort of that process of doing a scientific, you know, have a hunch, test it, see if you're right, that sort of organically happened with our project.
Great, thank you. And we'll just do actually questions for one speaker. And who from the audience has a question for Dr. Love, Chris McKinley? I know there's a lot of questions. Anybody in the audience have a question for Chris? Great.
This is for Chris on OkCupid. My hunch, back in the day when I was on OkCupid, was that they actually didn't want you to meet the person of your dreams, because then you would stay in the pool and they make more money. Can you confirm or disconfirm my hunch?
I think it's very hard for them because they don't have a lot of exit data. You know, people, the best that they can do is track conversations, and then, you know, conversations might die out and the people might not renew, and it's not clear whether they met their soulmates or they got bored or something else happened. So their data only goes so far, and to my knowledge, they just try and optimize conversations of length sort of 8 or longer, and it's pretty simple. Obviously, there is, you know, I guess some potential conflict of interest in that, but I don't have any specific information on, you know, how they address that conflict of interest.
Chris McKinley, I'll put you on the spot, and if you have a question for Matt Daniels from Polygraph.
Yeah, I have a question maybe just about data journalism or empirical journalism more generally. I followed 538 a lot this political campaign, and one sort of criticism of them I've seen emerge on Twitter in recent months is that they've sort of been data-enabled pundits this political season and haven't done very much to sort of attempt to falsify their own hypotheses about maybe Trump in particular. And I could see that being a easy trap to fall into, and I wonder if you guys think about those issues at all.
So this is a little bit speaking to the earlier question about hunches and instincts improving. So I had someone on Reddit, the worst comment I received on the film project was that the project was a bastardization of the scientific method, and that this PhD student was like, I'm gonna bring this to my students to show them how terrible like the scientific method is, which is semi-valid because I didn't have any scientific method. It was, in my opinion, kind of like the shootings project, a census, an exercise in gathering data, which a lot of people don't like because they're like, you have to have a hypothesis and then have a methodology and then prove a thing, and then that's how you say anything of merit. So I think the problem with 538, not that I'm like a fan or not fan of 538, is the proving process. And I think there's a world where we need journalists doing the scientific method, doing social science on a deadline. My opinion is I think there's a world also where data journalists, I'm not even a journalist, I make cool stuff with data, help people understand the space without trying to prove anything. Like, let me wrap my mind around mass shootings or police shootings or incarceration or my opinion, like gender inclusivity in media. That's what I think is interesting. So when we talk about like the pitfalls of what 538 had, which is putting too much into a model and realizing that they didn't have the right model, and they were trying to say that Donald Trump had no chance of winning because honestly the model was flawed in some ways, and Nate Silver pointed that out in his post-mortem. I think what they could have done, which I'm still waiting for an organization to do, is help people wrap their mind around the data of the election. Like, there's so many polls, favorability, unfavorability, we have all this data, and I'm still just reading pundit columns written in prose about what they think the data says and what the model says. And I'm no data scientist, and I can't understand a model, but I still have to trust what they say because the things they're doing are so complex. So I think the field for data journalism really is not trying to be in the game of proving things, but elucidating data in a way that I don't have to read a pundit's interpretation of a model.
Great. Actually, I know this is right up your alley, so yeah, a Lynn response, and then one more question from the audience while Lynn is responding. If anybody has a question, just put their hands up so I can run the mic over to you while...
I just want to say very quickly that I think Nate Silver, better than a lot of people working in this space, is always careful to give you the uncertainty around his estimates. He does that better than anybody. And I think a lot of the pushback on him in this cycle is sort of going way back to his days at the New York Times and this exact beef with reporters versus he as a data journalist, which was a word that didn't even exist when he was at the Times, and people who are just, going on talk shows and making statements. And so I think a little bit of the pushback is not warranted, because I think he's really careful when he says, I'm 80% sure, I'm 70% sure. Like, you just can't do better than describing your data in that way.
Great, thanks. And we're running short on time, so final question of the night, and then we'll have closing remarks from Ian. Final question.
What Farid, I'm with Webster's Institute. I have a question related to Donald Trump spots. And I'm wondering if they had a spot that showed clips of Donald Trump instead of using his words and showing faces of women, which made it somewhat
Hokey.
unrealistic and comical in a sense. And maybe that's why it was not effective.
Yeah, so there's a guy running for the Senate in Arkansas who did that. And we tested that ad too, where he actually had these clips from Howard Stern and all these other shows where Trump actually said these things. And that ad did a little bit better. So, there may be something with the very strange nature of that ad that I showed you, the women in the funny t-shirts with Trump's face on them. And But the ad that we tested, not for a presidential race, but for a Senate race, did do a little better.
Awesome. I think that's a wrap. Let's give a round of applause for all the speakers today.